Happy Thursday, everybody. Okay. Hopefully you all went to the common interest community training that we went on Tuesday. It's super important for any of you selling, particularly in the lakes area, because we do have a lot of common interest communities. If you have any questions about that training, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to walk you through anything that we didn't cover, or if you need some more help on certain aspects of a common interest community, I'm more than happy to help. On with that note passed, I wanted to talk to you guys about the buyer's move-in agreement, which is the addendum or an amendment to the purchase agreement. Okay. Addendum meaning you put it with the purchase agreement as you're writing it before it's accepted. An amendment is anything after the original purchase agreement has actually been accepted. Okay. Now we've talked about a seller's lease or purchase contingency, meaning the seller needs to find a property before they buy or before they sell the one that they're have on the market. We've talked about a buyer's um, sale of home contingency, meaning that the buyer needs to sell their home to be able to buy the one that they're putting in a purchase agreement on. And this one's a little different. This one's a buyer move-in agreement. So essentially, the buyer's asking the seller, can I move into your property before closing? And what does that look like for all parties? Now, I will put a big caveat to this. This should be an absolute last resort. Okay. Buyers, there are times where buyers want to move into the property early and then their financing doesn't come through. Okay. Now the seller has to go through an eviction process if the buyer refuses to leave, number one. Number two, buyer does not always understand that once they take possession of the property, they are responsible for the property. Okay. The water heater goes out, it becomes the buyer's issue. Essentially, their final walkthrough is their possession date, which is the day they move into the property, not the closing date, which is normal. My point being, you need to be very clear with all parties as you're talking to them with a buyer's move-in agreement about the potential downsides. And if there's any other option available before giving possession, that's always better. Okay. There are times, however, where buyer's move-in agreement is needed. You have to go through a probate or the seller has to go through a probate situation, and it's going to take 6 months before this is done, and the buyer needs a place to live, right? Make sure you talk with your managing director if you are going through a buyer's move-in agreement and you haven't done one before, so they can help you work through all of the pieces. Now, with that being said, let's talk about this agreement. You'll see on line one is the date. This is the date you're filling out the form, right? This is just a reference date. On line three, you have an option. This is either an addendum, meaning it's being written with the purchase agreement, or this is an amendment. It's being written after the purchase agreement has been accepted. I will tell you most of the time, these are going to be amendments, not addendums. Sometimes they will, but most of the time they're amendments because something has happened that will delay the closing and the buyer needs a place to live. That's usually when these agreements are used. Okay. Then it says amendment to purchase agreement between parties dated blah, blah, blah date. This is the date of the purchase agreement. This is that line one of the first page of the PA. Okay. So I think we've been using like July 16th or something. I don't remember. Then line 4 and 5 is talking about what property this is, right? Um, and so you would put in the property address. Hopefully, this is already filled out because you should have everything in your details page um, in transaction desk. And so these pieces will already fill out. But if it doesn't, that's where the address goes. Okay. Line 6 through 8 talks about the nature of what this document is about. Okay. It puts it in very clear terms so that everybody can understand. This agreement gives buyer the right to enter and occupy the property before closing on the purchase of this property. In the event of a conflict between this agreement, meaning the buyer's move-in agreement, and any other provision of the purchase agreement, the language in this agreement shall govern. Okay, so remember that. Mostly this has to do with additional earnest money, with possession dates, okay? But there will be pieces in here we'll talk about that come back to that. 9 to 10 talks about the possession date. This is when the buyer is taking possession of the property, okay? Seller agrees to deliver possession of the property to buyer at whatever time. 9 a.m. on the 20th of August, right? Please keep in mind, this means that your seller should not be at the property. Okay. When they give possession to the buyer, they are giving up their rights to occupy and walk into the property willy-nilly. They need to then essentially schedule a showing with the new buyer or with the buyer, the new tenant. Okay. This talks about additional earnest money, 11 through 15. Now, sometimes sellers who don't feel comfortable with having a buyer come into the property will ask for additional earnest money. You know, Mr. Buyer, this is your financing, your bank that's causing the closing date issue. It's not on my side as a seller, so I want more earnest money. Your seller might also ask that the buyer remove all their contingencies. So if the buyer doesn't buy the property, they'll get the seller will get the earnest money, right? So that's what this additional earnest money is talking about. It says when buyer signs this agreement, buyer shall deposit blah blah blah, say $1,000 with the listing broker, unless otherwise agreed to in writing, in certified funds as additional earnest money. At closing, this amount should be considered as part of the payment required under the purchase agreement and shall be credited against the purchase price. If buyer fails to pay the additional earnest money or close within the timeframes provided in the purchase agreement, such failure shall constitute a default. Now remember, the default language is in the purchase agreement. So if you then need to look at what that is, go back to the purchase agreement and look at the legalese on the default language. This needs to be with the listing broker ASAP. Okay. We usually treat it like earnest money in general. So 2 days. Once this agreement is signed, 2 days, it needs to be to the listing agent. Okay. Sometimes the seller's really nice and you can just put zero in here. They don't need additional earnest money. They're fine. Or buyer's already putting $25,000 in earnest money. They don't need more. Okay. That's all right too. Then it talks about the security and the damage deposit. On blank date, buyer shall deposit blank amount of money with the seller in certified funds as a security and damage deposit. The deposit shall earn statutory interest at the rate prescribed in Minnesota statute. The deposit plus interest less any amounts due seller for rent or damages arising out of the buyer's breach of this agreement, or to reimburse seller for the cost of repairing damage to the property, including personal property and appliances, caused or resulting from buyer's possession of the property, shall be refunded to buyer at closing or after buyer leaves the property and gives possession to the seller. If seller keeps all or a portion of the deposit, then seller shall provide buyer with a written statement within the time required by Minnesota Statute 504B 178. Okay, this is talking about obviously a security and damage deposit we're all familiar with, right? We usually do them when we rent a property. We give a security and damage deposit, and that's held in trust. In trust, that doesn't go into a regular account. It goes into a trust account that's held in trust until you leave the property. And then if the seller agrees that everything's put back to how it should be, then you get your security and damage deposit back, right? So that's how it normally works. This is the same thing. However, I will warn you, most sellers do not have a trust account. So if you're putting in a security and damage deposit requirement, you need to make sure one, either your seller has a trust account, or two, you change in this other category down at the bottom You change who is holding that security and damage deposit because it has to be in a trust account. Can the seller go set up a trust account? Abso-flippin-lutely. Yep. Our job is not only to collect the money, not deposit it, but collect it and then make sure it's going into a trust account, particularly if we're a buyer's agent, right? Okay. And then all of the rules with the trust account applies to those things. I would say most of the time I see additional earnest money being used versus a security and damage deposit, just so you know. So if this is zero, then this is zero. That's okay too. Okay. Now, the move-in fee. This is a daily fee, okay, that the buyer will pay the seller. Now, most of the time when the buyer moves in, they will pay the seller mostly to help the seller cover their mortgage costs, right? That's usually why these come in. And so they will pay the seller a certain amount per month because that covers the mortgage. But in this form, this is a per day cost. So you need to take that mortgage amount and divide it by 31 or 30, depending on how many days the buyer is going to be in there, and put that move-in fee into here. This is essentially a daily rent. Okay. Sometimes agents just make it easy on themselves and they say $25 a day. Oops, I went too far. Sorry. Okay. Well, let's read this real quick. Buyer shall pay seller blank amount of money per day, beginning on the possession date, so the date the buyer moves in, and continuing through the closing date or the date the buyer vacates the property, whichever happens first. So if the buyer cancels the purchase agreement, moves out before the closing date, then they don't have to continue paying until the agreed upon closing date. Okay. Buyer shall pay seller the move-in fee charges in full on possession date, in full on the possession date. If the purchase agreement is not closed by the scheduled closing date, buyer shall pay additional move-in fee charges to seller weekly in advance. Seller shall refund to buyer any unearned move-in fee charges at the actual closing. This is meant to be a short-term agreement. Buyer needs to move in for a couple weeks, right? Maybe a week, maybe 2 months, right? That's what this agreement is meant to be. That's why this says this move-in fee is going to be paid in full when the buyer takes possession. This is not trust money. This can go directly to the seller. This is rent money. Okay. And so all of this money goes directly to the seller on the possession date. If the buyer cancels, then the seller has to refund any money that wasn't used in the agreement. Okay. Now, for practical things, if they're just moving in for a week, the buyer and seller are happy with it, they're fine with it. I've seen where this is zero, where the seller charges the buyer nothing. They don't charge them an additional earnest money deposit. They don't charge them a move-in fee. They don't charge them a security and damage deposit. Like that's okay. You can absolutely do that. Um, because like I said, this is normally a very short-term agreement. It can be even a day before closing that you put this agreement into place. Okay. I say okay, like there's people here who are going to answer me. Sorry. I'm going to stop saying okay. Let's go on to utilities. 29 and 30. Utilities. Buyer agrees to place all utility services in the buyer's name effective on the possession date. Remember the date they move in, and to pay all bills for utility service during the period of buyer's possession as they become due. So the buyer is now required to pay all the utilities for the property, which means the seller has to cancel theirs and the buyer has to move it over into their name on that possession date. If you want to change this, let's say the buyer is moving in the day before closing and 1 day of utilities is not going to break the bank for anybody, you can, in the other category, say line 29 and 30 do not apply. Buyers shall move utilities into their name on the closing day. Absolutely, you can do that. Okay. Now, 31 to 35 talks about insurance. Buyer and seller shall consult with their respective insurance companies. Can you tell me why? I will tell you. Because homeowners insurance is different than renters insurance, and renters insurance is different than landlord insurance. Your different insurance policies cover different things. So both parties, both the buyer and the seller, need to check with their insurance companies to determine if occupation of the buyer of the property will be covered in the event an insurance claim needs to be made. Okay. It then goes on to say seller shall maintain casualty insurance on the property to be effective through the closing day. Buyer shall purchase and maintain liability insurance to be effective from the possession date, from the day they move in. Before taking possession of the property, according to the terms of this agreement, buyer shall deliver to seller an insurance binder in compliance with the provisions of this agreement. Buyer is responsible for buyer's personal property insurance. So, seller is going to have their insurance on the property, and buyer is essentially going to have renter's insurance on their property. Have them go talk to their insurance company when they're doing this. Okay. Each person is going to have their own insurance. 36 to 38. This is where people mess up and where they do not explain to their buyers what the requirements are. The buyers are not renters anymore. They are buying a property. Okay. 36 through 38 talks about maintenance. Buyer shall be responsible for all repairs and maintenance of the property and personal property covered by the purchase agreement from and after the possession date. Buyers shall maintain the property and personal property in reasonable repair and order. What this means is when the buyer moves in, they are now responsible for any cost associated with repairs or maintenance of all the appliances, any personal property that they've put in the purchase agreement, and the property itself. The water heater goes out, it's the buyer's bill. The HVAC needs to be serviced, it's the buyer's bill. The septic fails, it's the buyer's bill. Does that make sense? And hopefully you explain this well to your buyer. The whole point is your buyer wants to buy the property. These are going to be their homeowner costs anyway. It's their job to do that. If you come to a different agreement between the seller and your buyer, that the seller's actually going to act as more of a landlord, you might want to look at a rental agreement, not a buyer's move-in agreement. That will have more protections for your buyer and your seller. Then we go on to inspection. Buyer has the right to walk through property prior to the possession date to establish that the property is in substantially the same condition as of the date of the purchase agreement. This is our final walkthrough. We usually do a final walkthrough at right before the closing date to make sure that the property is in substantially the same condition as of the date of the purchase agreement, because that's what the buyer agreed to buy. Because the buyer is moving in early, their final walkthrough is going to be sooner. It's going to be prior to the possession date or their move-in date to make sure that the seller still has the property in the same condition as when they put in the purchase agreement. I recommend using a final walkthrough agreement for this particular inspection. Say buyer signs off saying, yep, property is what I thought it was when I put in the offer. Then we go on to page 2. Talks about use of the property, hold harmless cause, quiet enjoyment, and termination. Use of the property. Buyers shall occupy the property exclusively as buyer's personal residence during the term of this agreement. Buyers shall make no alterations to the existing buildings or improvements on the property, nor make any other improvements on the property during the term of this agreement, without first obtaining the written consent of the seller. Buyers shall neither assign buyer's rights nor sublease the property under this agreement. Your buyer can't rent it out. Your buyer can't remove things from the property yet because while they have equitable interest in the property they're now living in, they do not have full control over what can and cannot be done on that property. So if they're planning on tearing down that shed in the yard after they actually close on the property, but they move in sooner than the closing date, you have to let your buyer know you cannot tear down that shed until after the closing date. Or we have to go get written permission from the seller before you tear down that shed, before you add a window, before you change the siding, before you dig up the yard to make jumps for your kids on their dirt bikes. Anything, any improvements on the property. You have to have it in writing with the seller if you're using this agreement. Hold harmless clause. This is just a blanket liability clause that the seller is not responsible for any liabilities, claims, or expenses from the buyer's use, possession, and occupancy of the property. And buyer shall hold the seller harmless. Okay, just a blanket clause. Seller's not responsible. Quiet enjoyment. Remember when I said earlier the seller has to leave the buyer alone once they get into the property? Quiet enjoyment is a part of that. Seller promises upon buyer's performance of buyer's obligation in this agreement, buyer shall peacefully and quietly have, hold, and enjoy the property according to this agreement. If the seller forgot to move something out of the attic, they cannot just show up at the buyer's door and walk in. Okay? They have to hopefully go through you guys as agents and set up a showing to be able to go in there. Then termination. This one is important. This is if the buyer and seller do not close on the property and what happens afterwards. If the purchase agreement is not closed, buyer shall leave the property and give possession to the seller within 7 calendar days from the date of seller's written notice to leave, and this agreement shall end. Notice it doesn't say closing date, it says seller's written notice to leave. So if it does not close, seller has to give written notice to the buyer that they need them out of the property. Notice is considered given on the date mailed to buyer at the above address. Buyer shall leave the property in the same conditions as it was when possession of the property was delivered. If buyer fails to leave the property and give possession to seller, seller is authorized to take any action permitted by law to recover possession of the property. Seller shall be entitled to recover from buyer, in addition to all charges and reimbursements reserved in this agreement, damages for seller's loss of use in the amount of blank amount per day, beginning with the date buyer was to have given possession to the seller, and all reasonable costs which result from obtaining possession of the property and enforcing the terms of this agreement, including reasonable attorney fees. Essentially, if the buyer refuses to leave the property after that 7 days, they will have to pay whatever amount you put in here, $500 per day to the seller until they leave. Seller has the legal right to go get a lawyer, start eviction proceedings, sue the buyer for the money that they're losing, which is this amount, plus any costs that the seller has. So please, one, as a buyer's agent, make sure that this isn't too high for your buyers, right? We usually see $100 a day. Okay, buyer has to pay $100 a day until they leave. As a seller's agent, make sure that this is filled out and it's not 25 cents per day, right? That's no good for your seller if your buyer decides to stay at the property, especially in midwinter when it's harder to evict, right? So this is a negotiated fee. That's why it's a fill-in piece. But this is the piece that protects your seller later and encourages your buyer to get out after that 7-day mark. Hopefully, it doesn't come to that. But we have seen it where it does, which is why I don't fully recommend buyers move-in agreements. This should be your last resort. Then, of course, there's the other category where you can determine different terms that's within this agreement or add additional terms like seller can leave things in the shed, right? We're not going to worry about those possessions because we don't need that. We just need to live in the house. Okay. Seller signs and dates, buyer signs and dates. And then you add this to the full purchase agreement. Now, with that being said, and all of that stuff there, this is not a garage possession agreement. If the buyer just wants to move boxes into the garage so they don't have to pay for a storage unit in between, that's different. They still need to insure that stuff. And I'm going to look. I wonder if we have a clause in here for garage move-in. But a garage move-in agreement does not need to be as big as this is. Here we go. Possession of garage. Okay. This just says closing of this transaction is scheduled for blank closing date. Now, I use the other category on this form. I'm going to back up a minute. I use the other category on this form just to get to the clauses. If you're going to use a possession of garage amendment, you should be using a blank amendment to the purchase agreement. Okay. Sellers agree buyers may begin storing their personal possessions into the garage on the property on blank date. They may not take actual possession of the property until after the closing date. Buyers agree they shall be responsible for liability and personal property insurance for their possessions and agree to hold sellers and real estate agency harmless from any responsibility for any damage to their possessions during this time. If for any reason this transaction should not close, the buyers shall have a period of 72 hours to remove their possessions from the property. Okay. So it's a little easier, but essentially it's saying, yep, Mr. Buyer, you can move your stuff into my garage, but I as the seller, I'm not insuring that stuff and I can't guarantee that it's going to be safe always. So you are taking a risk, Mr. Buyer, by allowing your stuff to be moved in here, but you absolutely can do that. Can do that. Okay. So this buyer's move-in agreement should not be used for possession of garage. If that's all the buyer wants, possession of the garage, the shed, this type of agreement should be used instead on an amendment to the purchase agreement. Okay. Hopefully that helps everybody out, and I will see you all next week. Thanks so much.